So as the topic goes, it's about knowing your vendor ecosystem, right, and building a resilient third-party cyber defense. So basically, towards the theme of this ISOC, priming for cyber defense includes your third parties as well. So for those of you who have seen the Verizon DBIR, the Data Breach Investigations report this year, you will see one category popping up very heavily. It's around third-party breaches. They mentioned that it doubled year on year, and the breaches increased from 15 to 30% from a 2024 perspective. So you'll see different charts along the way as well, and you'll see that there's very interesting patterns around system intrusion, basic web attacks going down, as well as having some of the attacks around risk going up as well. But one of the interesting trends here is using stolen credentials, right? So it kind of makes sense from a threat actor perspective. I rather log in than trying to do all my crazy hacker stuff, right? So just logging in, getting access will be much simpler than doing all of the hacking work that I want to do. So if we do a reality check here, right? So a lot of breaches today in 2024, and this is an increasing trend as well, it's all third-party related. A lot of ransomware increasing as well, right? About 40% plus is starting through a third party. So attackers are getting smart. They're using the connections that you trust to get into systems. Unfortunately, across APAC, less than 40% of organizations have dedicated teams dealing with this risk, right? Coming from a vendor perspective. So when we look at the Verizon DBIR, we see that 80% of APAC breaches come from system intrusions, right? So attackers are attacking systems that are well known. That can also come in through a third-party breach as well. So when we look across the board as well from a Filipino perspective, a lot of organizations do suffer breaches from a supply chain perspective, 84.5% to be specific, but a lot of companies don't have a way to detect that they have a breach because of a third party. They rely on a third party to tell them, I had a breach, right? So this is a disclosure mechanism instead of a detection mechanism. And this means that there is a high level of risk that you don't discover a breach until it happens much after it happens as well. One of the key things that we want to drive about here is that the supply security issues are part of your risk. I can outsource my function and work, but the risk remains with the organization, right? So this is something that a lot of times we forget, right? We think that when we outsource the work, the risk goes to the outsourced party as well. So even if I have the best defense in depth in the world, my partners, suppliers, and vendors still have some form of access to my environment. So think about partners, vendors that have access to your data. You send data to them for processing. So for example, DBS Bank in Singapore had a breach recently coming from a third party because they outsourced a vendor to print letters to their premium customers. So that's PII data, right? Your customer names, your customer addresses, as well as details and contents of the letter as well. You have suppliers to support your operations. They go down, my business fail. Or if they have integration, that's a direct path through your layered defenses as well. So as we see an increase in supply chain breach across the board, we realize one interesting trend. A lot of organizations think that they have their third-party risk under management. They think they are managing it. But surprisingly, when you do a proper statistics around it, most organizations are only monitoring a subset of their vendors. They have no idea, for example, what the vendors, the HR team is using. Which is the talent acquisition firm that my HR is using? Which legal law firm am I talking to support my company's operations? The IT team wouldn't know. The InfoSec team definitely wouldn't know either. Would the third-party risk team know? That depends on whether you have a proper third-party risk team. And surprisingly, most of the GRC, governance, risk, and compliance experts expect audit findings around this, around the third-party risk program. So the last point here to think about is where's the expertise in the organization. So within an organization, you have security expertise. That's where the audience here is as well, right? We're on cybersecurity. We know our cybersecurity very well, but we mostly sit in the SOC. But what about the third-party risk team? They mainly sit in the compliance function, the governance risk compliance function. The challenge here is within the same organization, these two teams are not really talking to each other, right? So therein lies a gap, right? Because where's the ownership now? When an incident happens, security is fault, right? Security is problem. But before an incident happens, it's compliance problem. So where do we have the collaboration between the two teams? How do you prevent a supply chain breach against organization as well? And last but not least, do you know how to respond when an incident does happen? Or do you respond as that incident happens? Do you have a playbook, for example? Or do you want to build that playbook as you go along while incidents happening as well? So here's a challenge to the crowd in this team. This is a vendor called Power School. They are in the education technology space. They develop systems to train people, right? And they're popular with schools. And this is all they have, right? They have SOC 2 Type 2, they have ISO 20001, they do annual pen testing with external third party, they have regular vulnerability scanning, they have DevSecOps, so security is integrated into part of their development cycle. They have extensive security training and specific role-based security training. So developers get developer security training. So for those of you who rely on questionnaire today to do your third-party risk, this is definitely going to look like a very good vendor, right? It checks all the right boxes. They have everything in place, and this is a vendor that I definitely want to work with. Unfortunately, they were breached, right? So it's a trick question here. So they were breached, and 60 million students and teachers' details were all lost and stolen by the threat actors. And when we digged in, we found they actually had a lot of leaked credentials than on average, 50 times more than average, with 390 critical and high CVEs present on their systems publicly. So when we digged in, whose fault is this? Is it the company's fault for not doing the check? Or is it this company for declaring that they were okay? So how do we drive this problem as well? When we look at the breaches across the board as well, it's becoming bigger and more costly. We see this with Change Healthcare. We saw this with CDK, especially in the States. All of them definitely had SOC 2 Type 2s. They definitely had their due diligence completed by someone in the compliance team, evaluated by the security team. All of them were still breaches to the company from a third party, because Snowflake was a place that you stored data. You had Change Healthcare, which had PII and healthcare data, CDK, and all of this as well. So when we think about supply chain, there's usually a confusion of what do you mean by supply chain or third party, right? So this is where you want to think about your entire business itself, right? It's not just the technology vendors that you want to consider. Across your entire business, for different business units, they have their own vendors, right? Every part of the business units, you usually have their own vendors. It's not just technology vendors that you need to care about, because there is data, there is sensitive information that we share with our vendors as well. What about my vendor's vendor, right? So that's what we call a fourth party ecosystem. So how far do you want to go down the path? It depends on your risk appetite, right? So this is what we call the nth party risk. Why do we want to care about fourth party? Is because of concentration risk. Imagine 60% of your vendors use the same AWS cloud service. AWS has a blackout, and it happened, don't laugh at it, had a blackout for 30 minutes, half the internet disappeared, right? So if majority of my vendors are using the same infrastructure or using the same vendor, that vendor creates a risk that I need to be worried about as well. So this is where we go down the path. So when we think about third-party risk, what you want to implement, and this is borrowing the term from XDR and CDRs, most of you will be familiar, into supply chain. We call this supply chain detection and response. So when we say detection and response, there are three key elements you want to think about. For detection, you need visibility. Number one, step one is visibility. Having visibility of all vendors in my environment is the first step, and then building the classifications and so forth. But for response, most organizations will be familiar with getting the suppliers or remediating the issues that we see about.
But the second part of response is incident response. Do I have a playbook within my organization to respond to a third-party risk? I'm pretty sure most organizations have a playbook for their own breach, for their own incident. But what if the incident is on my third party? Do I know what to do? Do I know how to respond? Who does what? Who do I call? Think about the call tree. Who's in that call tree? If it's a salesperson in the call tree, I'm sorry for the sales folks here. If the sales folks is in the call tree, that's the wrong contact, right? To have in the call tree when you have an incident. And you definitely don't want to be building an incident playbook when an incident is happening, right? You'll get no answers anywhere. Okay, so as we think about the third-party defense, there are 4 pillars that I want to highlight, right? So first and foremost, I highlighted this earlier, visibility, right? You want to have a complete inventory across the organization and begin a classification process around it. As much as possible, have a real-time module or posture monitoring for the organization, and you want to be able to do that across your entire organization. Map out the attack surface across your partnerships and have the conversation as well. So where do we start with the complete vendor inventory if you don't have a team? The best place to start with, if you don't have that, is your accounts payable team, your procurement and accounts payable team, because they know what vendor you have to pay. Right? You have the vendors, you have a list of vendors that you have to pay. That list is a starting list. Second item that you want to think about is how do you prioritize based on risk? Because again, if you think about it, okay, everyone wants unlimited resources in a company, but we will never get there, right? So how do I prioritize my resources to deal with this issue? You want to have a tier-based approach, right? You want to at least break it down into 3 different levels: critical, medium, and low, and then deal with that issues accordingly as well. So how do I have that? Is to have a way to score the issue, right? And this scoring itself will have to be dependent on your risk appetite. What impact does the business that I work with, the vendors that I work with, is to my organization, and what criticality are they at from a security perspective is the second thing you want to think about. The third thing here is around continuous monitoring. You want to have a continuous idea of where the company is at any point in time, right? So you want to see the statistics and trends and patterns of the company in a continuous fashion, because you don't want to respond on an annual basis. You don't want to have a situation where you have no idea what's happening until you do a questionnaire again, which is usually yearly or every contract, right? So if you think about how you do your vendor ecosystem today, it's either yearly or every contract. So you want to be as quick as possible to be able to respond when an incident happens, and that requires you to be able to have that alert mechanisms within company. Last but not least, I kept emphasizing on this, is instant response, right? You need to have the ability within the company, especially across organization capability, to respond to incidents that you're looking at. And this calls also for you to work with your vendor, right? It cannot be an instant response plan that I built in-house. I know how to respond, but it's not a problem that I'm facing alone. It's a problem that's coming from my third party. So I need to be able to work with my third party to be able to respond to this. And that also means that you should also do a tabletop exercise, especially with your critical vendors after you have done your incident response plan. Okay, so once you figure out who your vendors are, right? So I'm going to be quick. But once you figure out who your vendors are, this is a simple way of how you can tier out your vendors, right? So the critical suppliers here that are very essential to your continuous business operations, definitely tier 1, right? They fail, I fail, tier 1. Companies that support your key functions, where there are some temporary disruptions and it's still manageable, that's usually tier 2. But for the last ones, it's vendors that are more incidental. It's fine if they fail. It's fine if they go down. But I want to know when they have an issue, right? So that's where you start the basics of it. There are some companies that goes up to 5 tiers, right? So tier 1 to 5, but at least 3 tiers, right? So high, medium, low at a very minimum. Okay, so here's how we can get started, right? So The first 30 days is essentially trying to discover what's happening in your organization, where are these vendors and how are they coming from. Step one, figure out where your vendors is, work with your accounts payable team, AP, to identify your third parties, document, right? Figure out where the access levels is, categorize them, and define what the business impact of this vendor failures will be on the company. So that means that you need to plan out what happens if a vendor fails. How does that impact me, right? So you need to think about the what if as you go along. Next is to establish your baseline. What is the minimum standard that vendor in that tier has to be, right? So if you use a simple classification system, A to F, the lowest tier vendor has to be a C at minimum, for example, right? The second level, the tier 2s has to be a B at minimum, and the critical ones have to be an A at minimum, for example, right? So it can be at the different levels of tiering that you try and figure out where the risk is, and you have to standardize this across industry, right? It cannot be this industry is special, so I give them special privilege. Security has to be standardized across, right? So once you have that, you want to set a tolerance level. If they fall below the risk level, how much time do I give to the vendor for them to remediate as well, right? So that needs to be planned out in your policies. Last but not least is around your monitoring capability. So you need to have ability to not only figure out who my vendors are, but also where are they today, where are they tomorrow, and so forth, so on and so forth. So to have that continuous visibility for the vendors across the board. Okay, so the next 30 days. So what you want to do here is to then have that real-time dynamic way to look at the risk, right? So having that baseline and then having the real-time situation across the risk and be able to monitor that across organization as they evolve the attack surface, right? Internet is never stagnant. The internet attack surface will keep changing, so you need to follow through with the vendors as well. So having that visibility. Next is also having the visibility around the threat intelligence as well, right? How do I understand if this vendor is being targeted or the vendor is being used to target me, right? So there's also that kind of situation. And if the vendor has, for example, leak credentials, and that leak credentials is logging into my partner ecosystem, for example, right? Having that visibility is also key. So last but not least is being able to have a playbook, right? Knowing what to do when an incident happens, not just on yourself, but on my third party, right? So when my third party has an incident, it triggers my playbook. So I know what to do, how to respond when the incident happens across the board as well. And the last 30 days, so this is basically a 3-month plan, it's to then tune, right? So you want to play out your playbook itself, right? You want to test your playbook, find your gaps, understand the risk, identify the false positive, work with the vendors as well, make it a collaborative engagement, not a detection or a dictator style where I demand the vendor to have a certain level. It's a collaboration, right? Because they become more secure, it reduces your risk, right? It's a collaboration. So having the engagement with the vendors is key. Running the exercises, especially with your key vendors, is key. Some vendors may be very shy. They're like, oh man, I don't want to join your risk assessment. So the way to engage that is to help them understand that you're not looking for faults, right? Incident response is never looking for a fault. It's how do I move on, right? Doesn't matter how you get ransomware. I want to know what's happening to my data that you have after you get ransomware. How do I recover? Am I impacted? How do we move on, right? Forensics, which is coming afterwards, is to then figure out what happened. So incident response is how do I move forward? Am I impacted? How do I move forward? So work with your key suppliers to simulate this as well. Last but not least, measure and understand your effectiveness of a program, because ultimately the budget holders are my bosses, right? Are your bosses. So the bosses need to understand and the stakeholders need to understand what's happening, report it outwards, help them understand how you're reducing risk for the organization and the ROI of the program, right? Helping you maintain and keep the profits within the company as well. And of course, that comes to the conclusion. You have the third-party risks, understand the gaps, prioritize your critical vendors for enhanced monitoring, implement continuous security posture monitoring, identify and do your detection response across the board, and of course, measure continuously and optimize continuously. With that, thank you very much.